Another analysis that we can do is looking at the product or service line profitability. So, are our products priced properly? Which ones should we promote and advertise more aggressively? Which ones make us the most money, etc. So, we look at a company that manufactures 3 jackets. Their management is concerned that one of the jackets has low profitability and they're considering dropping the product. If the jacket is dropped, there's no change in total fixed costs for the coming year. So our fixed costs are already committed, we can't avoid them. So when we look at this example, we have the number of units sold last year, the revenue, and our unit variable costs, the unit contribution margin, and our allocated fixed costs gives us an operating profit per unit. So should we drop the Gale product line as it is currently only giving us 40 cents per unit towards our operating profit? So when we look at that analysis, we compare those unavoidable fixed costs. So without the product, as we can see in the top table, we would have operating profit of $129,000. But with the product, we have $144,000 in operating profit. So we're actually better off currently creating the product because of those unavoidable fixed costs. We should look at various things rather. Instead of dropping the product, what if we increased our marketing on that product and could we sell that? Also, things that we need to think about are if we drop one product line, would it affect the sales of another product line? Would employee morale be affected? So they might think they were in danger of being laid off if we start dropping product lines, etc. So now we look at any traceable cost. So here we have traceable or avoidable advertising costs. So the non-relevant costs are the unavoidable portion of fixed costs. So we could avoid those advertising costs. When we look at the fact that advertising costs could be avoidable, then that gives us a different story. Could we shift advertising costs? Is there any way that Gale could make a positive contribution after all relevant costs? Those are things that we need to ask when we're making this analysis. We can also look at services. So we have the services relevant cost analysis can be used by service and not-for-profit firms to determine if we want to add new services. So we have a women's center that is looking at a new service that will require $9,400 in additional funding. What we might want to think about is, can we recruit the people needed for the new service? Are there any liability issues that we need to address when we're creating that service? Would funding for the nurse service be available if we were successful in providing it? Are there other more productive uses for our resources? That could be, so do we have any unavoidable mix or any opportunity costs? Is there something else we could do with that space rather than provide the new service that is going to give us a deficit in the first year? For a short-term product mix decision, we want to make the best use of our existing resources, especially if we have a production constraint. So in this example, we go back to the jacket. So we have the Windy and the Gale jackets are manufactured in the same plant. They both require a sewing machine. There are 3 machines that can be run up to 20 hours per day, 5 days per week, for a total of 1,200 hours per month. The demand for both jackets exceeds the capacity of the 3 machines. So our production constraint is the sewing machine. So when we look at the short-term product mix decisions, we want to look at the contribution margin per our limiting resource or constraint. In this example, we want to know what our contribution margin is per the sewing machine hours. So we want to maximize our contribution margin for that resource. It takes 3 minutes to sew the Windy jacket and 2 minutes to sew the Gale jacket. The number of jackets that we can produce per hour. We have the contribution margin per machine per hour, which is the contribution margin per unit times the number of units we can make each hour, which is 20. And then we have the maximum production for each product given our 1,200 hour constraint. So we can either make 24,000 Windy or 36,000 of Gale, or a combination of the two. So when we look at this example with the production constraint for the sewing machine, all possible sales mix are represented on this line. So our slope is 36,000 divided by 24,000, or 3/2. So for units of Gale and units of Windy. So we have production of Windy results in a total contribution margin of 192,000, while production of Gale only results in a total contribution margin of 144,000. Windy is favored over the production of Gale. So this gives us another reason to look at only producing the Windy windbreaker and maybe discontinuing that Gale product line. If we have more than one production constraint, then we need to determine the best sales mix. And it becomes more complicated the more constraints that we have. So in addition to the sewing machine constraint, we also have inspection worker constraints. So we have 40 workers at 35 productive hours per week. Therefore, we have 5,600 hours available per month for inspection and packaging. Now we have two constraints. We have a contribution margin per unit. We have the inspection and packaging time per unit, the number of jackets that can get through the inspection process per unit, the contribution margin per machine hour, and the maximum production for each product. So we compare the line for inspections and packaging to the line for the sewing machine. So we have our production constraint for the sewing machine and our production constraint for the inspection and packaging activity. And where they cross is our feasible area. So here we have at 4,800 of the Gale and 2,080 of the Windy is where we cross. So these are our options looking at the two products. We can either make 0 of each with a contribution margin of 0. We can do 36,000 Gale with a contribution margin of 144,000. Or we can make only Windy and no Gale with a contribution margin of 179,200. Or we can make some Windy and some Gale with the highest contribution margin. When we're looking at decision making, we need to think about any behavioral and implementation issues. So we have to make sure that our strategic objectives are part of any decision. That way we don't just focus on short-term goals or short-term gains. One of those behavioral issues is in predatory pricing. Predatory pricing is when a company sets the prices below average cost with a plan to raise prices later to recover losses. So courts often find in favor of the defendants time after time in cases involving predatory pricing. And US congressional leaders are looking at revising laws related to predatory pricing to promote competition in previously uncompetitive industries. So one of the short-term behaviors that we want to avoid is predatory pricing, where we drop prices really low in order to increase market demand and then raise prices lower. Another reason for predatory pricing is to drive our competitors out of the market by pricing considerably lower than they do. Other behavioral and implementation issues that we have to be relevant at is that we want to maximize contribution margin while minimizing our fixed costs. Because relevant cost analysis focuses mostly on variable costs, we tend to ignore fixed costs a lot. However, if we focus too heavily on variable costs, we might feel pressure to replace those variable costs with fixed costs, which would have a negative result. We also want to make sure that we're not looking at irrelevant or sunk costs in our decision making. So we don't want to improperly classify fixed costs as relevant, and we don't want to spend too much time thinking about costs that can't be recovered under various decisions.